So we're starting applications. You notice on that learning goal there were no fraction questions. That was something we did yesterday as well, so that's something you definitely need to know how to do, but I want you to be able to just be very successful in the basic ones. So that's why the learning goal today was not much harder than the one from yesterday. On the test, there will be a question where you have to solve it and it's got fractions. Solved by factoring, it's got fractions. There will be one where you have to expand and simplify. The nice thing is with applications, usually the solving part is actually really easy. You're going to see that in these examples. It's pretty basic stuff. Like the factoring is pretty easy, and the expanding is pretty easy. Sometimes you have to expand, but we don't see many fractions. Okay? So really, it's the setup. Focus on how you set it up, where the equation that we're going to end up solving comes from. That's what you want to be thinking about. So this is a standard kind of question. The sum of the squares of two consecutive numbers is 1201. Find the two numbers. Remember what I told you back in Unit 1 when we did a whole bunch of word problems and applications? What do we always start a word problem with? Jaden? A let statement. And what do we usually let our variable represent? What's the trick that works in 99% of cases? Anybody remember? It's been a little while since we've done this. So let x represent, like what in this case? Anang? Yeah, one of the two numbers. And what do we always basically let it represent? The thing we're trying to find. So let's start with our let statement. Let, we're going to use x in this case. We don't always represent the first number, I'm going to say. In this case, it's totally safe to say the first number. In some cases, you just want to say one of the numbers. If you can, avoid saying the bigger one or the smaller one, because sometimes that actually makes it harder and causes you to make a mistake. But in this case, the first number is fine. What does consecutive mean? Riley? Very nice, with an example. I love it. So two numbers that one comes right after the other, like 1 and 2. Or if my first number is 7, what's the next consecutive number? 8. Here's a tricky one. If my first number is -4, what's the next consecutive number? Anang? -3. Some people would say -5, right? Be careful of that. That's going down the other way. We're going up. Next consecutive, not previous consecutive. Next means next one moving up. So -4, -3, -3, -2. So how would I represent the next consecutive number? Like what kind of a mathematical statement would I make? Rachel, do you know? Secure? X plus 1. Then x plus 1 is the next number. These questions are a little bit more simple, so we don't need two variables, whereas a lot of the other ones we will kind of have a let statement with two variables. But this is not the same as linear system equations. All right, now here's the tricky part. So I just want you to put your pencil down and watch. Here's where some people struggle with this, but what we do is we read the sentence. We have to make sense of it, understand what it's saying. So forget about the fact that it's two consecutive numbers for a minute. And it's just two numbers. And let's say my two numbers are A and B. What is this saying? It's saying the sum, which means I add them, of the squares of two numbers. So the square of A is A squared, and the square of B is B squared. The sum of the squares of the numbers is 1201. So that would be like if my numbers were, and again, forget about the consecutive parts. So let's say my numbers were 3 and 5. The sum of the squares would be 3 squared plus 5 squared, right? So my two numbers are 3 and 5, but I want the sum of the squares of those two numbers. 9 plus 25, so 34, but whatever, okay? That's what this means. Some people think every question, this is how you write the formula, and that's not true. There are other questions in the textbook, such as, what if it said the square of the sum of two numbers? There's the sum of two numbers. There's the square of that sum. And we know this is different from a squared plus b squared. So when it says the sum of the squares, that means one thing. If it says the square of the sums, that means another thing. What if it said the product of two numbers? What does product mean? Jaden? Good. So the product would just be a times b equals something. So people struggle with how do you get this next statement that we're going to write in a moment. But you have to be able to read the question and make sense of it and understand which kind of a question it is. So the sum of the squares of our two consecutive numbers, one of our numbers is x. What is the square of x? X squared. And I'm going to add that to the square of the other number. That's the sum of the squares of my two unknown numbers, but they're consecutive because one of them is x and one of them is x plus 1. And then it says is, that's a really important word, even though it's small, 1201. That's the setup. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of understanding, a lot of work going in there. From here on in, all you're doing is solving till the very end, and then we'll do a little bit more word problem stuff. But right, so once you've got it set up, this should be a relatively easy question to go ahead and solve. But it's a setup part that people do struggle with, and it's a setup part that we're practicing and working on right now. The sum of the squares. This is the sum of the squares of two numbers. One of them's x, one of them's x plus 1, so they're consecutive. And that sum is equal to 1201. Okay, so how are we going to solve this? Expand, simplify, move it to one side, factor, solve. That's what we mean. So get started on that, give that a try. You can do x plus 1 squared the long way, but if you know how to do it, it's just x squared plus 2x plus 1. Move the 1201 over, so minus 1201. So hopefully you got kind of that so far. You don't have to do it all in one step, just like me, but eventually you get there. And then collecting like terms, you might get something like that. What do I do next? Tara, what do you think? Common factor, I love it. Common factor of? What do you think? 2. Always, 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 always. Common factor first. Makes your life easier. Yes? Nope. It's 2x squared. X squared times x squared is x to the 4th. Whoops. Plus x minus 600. Make sure you factor correctly. Otherwise, it's never going to work out. Divide both sides by 2. I mean, you don't have to do this, sort of up to you, but let's do it to make it nice and simple. And then, oh my gosh, some people say 600. How am I supposed to do this? Yes. It was, yes, 1 minus. Yeah. How in the world would you do a question when it's big numbers like this? Well, you have to, it's actually not that hard as long as you're kind of on the ball and getting this stuff. When I look at this, I see two numbers that multiply to a negative, so they have a different sign. So that means their signs are different. See, I just said that. That means that, sorry, they add to 1, not subtract 1. Sorry, I'm waiting for this to come up. Add to 1. Or, sorry, they subtract to 1. Different signs. So when you add them, they subtract to 1. So they're consecutive. So, try this. I don't know, 20 times 21. Close. 28 times 29. Okay, it's between those. 23 times 24. I know what the answer is. I'm just pretending. 24 times 25. There it is. Not that hard. You got to ballpark it and then just try a few different combinations until you get the answer. Okay. Yeah, we're going to see a few big numbers, but it's almost always simple trinomials, and it ends up being really, really easy. Okay, so that was x and 24 and x and 25. And then the 25 is plus, the 24 is negative. This is a little bit tricky. It'll make more sense with the next example, but, oops. The question was asking for two consecutive numbers. Those are not the two numbers. 24 and negative 25 are not consecutive. This is a little bit tricky. So some people say, oh, so the numbers are 24 and 25. Or maybe you'd say 24 and negative 25. Nope, that's not true. Always a really good idea when you're done. My point here was to find the value of x. I found it. I go back up and I say, what is x? X is the first number. X plus 1 is the next. I found two examples of the first number. Right? So if x equals 24, x plus 1 is 25. If x is negative 25, x plus 1 is negative 24. There are two answers to this problem. The numbers are 24 and 25, or negative 25 and negative 24. Very important that you recognize that's two answers. Like I said, if you're a little bit fuzzy on that, it'll be a bit more obvious in the next example what I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is some people get confused and they think these are the two numbers. Those are two different possibilities for the first number only. It's different. Okay? And some questions will have two answers, some will only have one for a different reason than we've seen. And it's a big part of our job to figure out which one's which. Any questions about that before we move on to the next one? So that was a straightforward numbers type question. The other kind of question we often see is like area and perimeter kind of questions. One of the other types that we often see. So we're going to start with our let statements. What do you think should be my first let statement? Jaden? Nice. Let L represent the length and Next one. Mahmoud, what do you think? Good idea, and we kind of are going to use an A, but we actually know what the area is, so we don't need to do that. What's our other unknown? What are we trying to find? What are the dimensions? So L is 1. Height, yeah, or I'm going to use width, but yes, exactly. So let W represent the width. You're right. You could say it's height, but we often think of it as length and width. So there's our two dimensions. And how, like, it helps when you see one of these questions in advance. If we're given the perimeter, I have to use that first to do this. So I'm going to go perimeter equals 2 times length plus 2 times width. That's just the formula. Gives me the perimeter. And I'm going to solve this. I can solve it for L or for W. I'm going to solve this one for L. So I'm going to subtract 2W from both sides. And divide everything by 2. 32 divided by 2 is 16. 2W divided by 2 is W. So if you're using two variables, which often you will, you have to do that somehow. It's not always perimeter. There's other kinds of questions, but somehow you have to write one of them in terms of the other. So this is width written in terms of length, or length written in terms of width. Everybody okay with that? That's like one of the steps in setting this up, just thinking about how you use perimeter. Now, what's the formula for area? Area is length times width. Again, we know the area. It's given to us. It's 60 kilometers squared equals the length, which is 16 minus W, times the width, which is just W. So that's the word problem part. That's the application part, the hard part. Now we just solve. 60 equals 16W minus W squared. Just distributing. I'll move everything to the left, so W squared is positive. And go ahead and try to factor. Simple trinomial. Two numbers that multiply to 60 and add to 16. Six and 10. Okay, so I got W equals 10 and W equals 6. Everybody okay with that? See what I mean by you didn't get the dimensions? This doesn't say length is 10, width is 6. It says width is 10 or width is 6. Kind of means the same thing, I know. There's an important distinction here that it gives you the dimensions or it gives you two possible answers for the width. In some cases, they end up meaning the same thing. In some cases, they don't. So we'll just watch. here's what we would do in this case. If W equals 10, length equals 16 minus W, 16 minus 10, which is 6. If W equals 6, length equals 16 minus 6, which equals 10. Now these are actually the same answer to the problem. My dimensions are 10 by 6 or 6 by 10. It's the same thing. It's not two different answers if you just reverse them. I don't know that it would be wrong, that you'd be marked wrong if you said it that way. But in this case, just because of how we interpret this problem, these are the same answers. So therefore, the dimensions are 6 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Okay, so you don't need to write it both times. You also don't have to do this twice. If you know that it's going to be the same thing, you do have to show it, but you show it once and then you're done. Okay, you don't have to show it twice and say it's the same answer, but it doesn't always work out this way. Some questions work out like this. You get a positive version and a negative version. Sometimes it works out like this, where you get like the same, they're just flipped. And sometimes you get two totally different answers. Okay? So be a little bit careful. When it's a consecutive number question, you don't have to show any work. You don't have to do this. Because really we have to show work to 24 and 25. No, next consecutive number is fine. You just stay it. So you get to this part here, and then just state your final answer. For a question like this, you would have to show the step to find the other dimension. Okay, any questions? One more. One of the legs of a right triangle is 7 centimeters longer than the other, and the hypotenuse is 17. Find the lengths of the legs of the triangles. What do we start with? Sometimes before you start with your let statements, you might draw a diagram, but in this case, I think we can start with our let statements. Let X represent what? I know you're still writing, but what do you think? Megan? Very nice. Don't just say one of the legs, the length of one leg. And I'm going to let Y represent the length of the other leg. Okay? So what does Y equal? Ziggy, what do you think? Not sure. Riley? Yeah, I could do 7 less than X, so that would be like X minus 7. Or what else could I do? Zakira? X plus 7. Those would both work. Either one's fine. Whatever comes to you first is fine. So what does this mean? It means I have a triangle. Ooh, not a very good triangle. One side is X. The other side is X plus 7. And this side is 17. Now I have to come up with an equation that I can solve. What do you think I'm going to use? It's not area. I'm not given the area. What can I do this time?
I guess like a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Very good. What do we call that? Mahmoud?
The Pythagorean theorem.
Very nice. Pythagorean theorem. So see how, it could be anything. One of them was the sum of the squares. I talked about square root of the sum. Talked about product. This one is Pythagorean theorem. Area was one of them. This one's Pythagorean theorem. So x squared plus x plus 7 squared, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Every question is going to be a little bit different. You can't just look at the first example we did and do every question that way, because the formula that we come up with here is always a little bit different. Liam?
You know the x plus 7, that's 7 times possible number is the hypotenuse.
It says the hypotenuse is 17. It says the other two sides are called legs. In a right triangle, the two sides that are right angle are called legs. We don't refer to them that way very often, but that's what they're called. So one of the legs of a right triangle is 7 centimeters longer than the other leg. So it kind of says that in there. But
You have to make a lesson with the line put on the first question.
you don't have to. Yeah, you don't have to in this case. In some cases, like the last one with length and width, I would say you should. In this case, you wouldn't have to. But some people like to just kind of stick with two, have an x and a y. It's nice at the end, too. So some people like to do it that way. Okay, go ahead and try to solve that. Expand, simplify, move everything to one side.
I don't know when we're always gonna move everything to one side to make it 0. Like when we do that,
Pretty much always.
whenever you can.
Sure. So I got x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals 289. Right, so this right here is x plus 7 all squared. Collected like terms, 2x squared plus 14x plus 49 minus 289, and 2x squared plus 14x minus 240 equals 0. Everybody get that? Okay, now you got to factor it. What's our first step? Always, 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 always. Common factor first. There's a common factor. See, but these are easy. Like common factor of 2, how easy is that? Everything's even. 2 bracket x squared plus 7x minus 120 equals 0. Divide both sides by 2. X squared plus 7x minus 120 equals 0. And then come up with two numbers. Oh, 120 is so big. Yeah, just start dividing it by things. Divide it by 12, that gives you 10. That's not going to work. Divide it by, 14, 15, 16. Just try a few and you get it pretty quickly. Right? You're going to divide it by something. It's not going to be like divided by 2. 2 and 60 don't have a difference of 7. Not divided by 3. 3 and 40. Like, it's not actually that hard. And you should get 15 and 8. So x is negative 15 and x is 8. So in the first question, we got like positive and negative 24, negative 25 type thing. So kind of one and the other. And we had two answers. In question number 2, example number 2, we got two answers, but they were basically the same answer. This one's different. What's different about this one? Anybody have an idea? Do I have two answers? Two possible answers to this question, Megan? What do you think about these answers? Okay, good to notice. Yeah. Jaden? One of them's negative. Why is that relevant? Don't forget what this is all about. Let x represent the length of a leg. You can't have negative length. We've seen this before. Inadmissible. This does not mean that every negative answer is inadmissible. It's inadmissible because it's a length. Sometimes negative answers are inadmissible. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes positive answers are inadmissible. You got to think. So if x equals 8, y is x plus 7, 8 plus 7, which is 15. So the negative 15, when I flip it to a positive, was my other answer. But you got to show that work. It doesn't always work that way. Often it does, but it doesn't always work that way. Okay, so you can't just make assumptions. We always do this little thing here. Any questions? Are 8 centimeters and 15 centimeters.